Welcome to Top Class with me, Duncan Crawford, where we're discussing why apprenticeships are crucial to filling job skills gaps. Digital technology, net zero initiatives and other changes are reshaping businesses, making the need for skilled workers more critical than ever. But many employers struggle to find people with the right skills. What can be done about it? Well, you may be unsurprised to hear that today we're talking about apprenticeships as a potential solution. Apprenticeships mix on-the-job experience with classroom learning and offer employers the chance to recruit and train people to meet their skills needs. But in many countries, apprenticeships are often only associated with trades such as construction, manufacturing and engineering. The OECD says there are huge opportunities for apprenticeships to expand into a wider range of sectors. So, to discuss all of this, I am joined by Doug Walton, an associate at Abt Global, a US research and consulting firm, and Dr. Bryan Coyne from the Faculty of Business and Social Sciences at Atlantic Technological University in Sligo, Ireland. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Now, I want to start by asking about the current situations in the US and Ireland. Are apprenticeships common in many industries, or is there a lot of scope for them to be expanded? Doug Walton, what's the situation in the US?
Sure. So in the US, apprenticeship is a relatively small component of the workforce training system. In the US, apprenticeships are overseen by the US Department of Labor. Currently, there are only about 700,000 active registered apprenticeships through the Department of Labor, out of a workforce of over 170 million, so less than one half of 1% of the population, the workforce. And then where apprenticeship has been used, it's typically been in the so-called building trades, construction. Electrician is the single largest apprenticeship occupation in the U.S. So it's traditionally been in the building trades, and it's a relatively small component of the U.S. workforce.
Professor Bryan Coyne, what's the situation in Ireland? Is it similarly such a small proportion of the jobs in Ireland?
So I suppose it was very concentrated, as Doug mentioned in the American case, similar in Ireland, it was very concentrated in the craft trades traditionally, your electricians, carpenters, things like that. And I suppose one thing that was recognised at a government level back, I suppose, around 2013 was that there was an action plan for apprenticeship put in, which was designed to improve the provision of apprenticeships in non-traditional sectors. And a lot of that, I suppose, is rooted in the traditional labour market lens of thinking, well, skills mismatches, are we getting the right people in the right jobs? How can we address a tight labour market where we might not have the right number of people for the right level of jobs, and also people with the relevant skills to carry out those jobs? Because other research in Ireland would have noted that there is a high degree of skills mismatch, where although we might have a very qualified workforce, do they have the relevant skills? They might be overqualified in many instances, but it's about matching. It's about playing matchmaker in the market. An apprenticeship is a pathway by which we can sort of play Cupid in a sense and bring people together with the jobs that they are after and that the jobs that are needing,
Very interesting indeed. And speaking of matchmaking in the jobs market, to bring Doug Walton back in, Doug, you've analysed the outcomes of a specific US initiative that aimed to get more apprenticeships, or more apprentices, I should say, into high growth jobs and industries. I've seen you present about this before, and a lot of the findings were very promising. So tell us about that.
That's right. It's really exciting research. So in recent years, the U.S. Department of Labor has sought to expand apprenticeship into new occupational sectors and to new populations through various grant programs. DOL provides grants to local organizations to expand apprenticeship. One of those recent grant programs was the American Apprenticeship Initiative. My firm led a study of that grant program, and we found that the expansion effort was very successful in expanding apprenticeships into new occupations, such as healthcare and information technology. And we found that there were benefits for both apprentices and employers. Apprentices, on average, who completed the program experienced a 50% increase in earnings. The earnings increases were broad-based across all demographic groups, across all occupations, and employers who sponsored apprentices experienced a positive return on investment. For every dollar spent on apprenticeship, on average, employers received back $1.44 in gain, so a 44% return on investment. So it's really a win-win, we found, for both apprentices and for employers.
Is that data suggesting that for a lot of people who took those apprenticeships, that if they had taken a different path, then in all likelihood, they would have probably ended up in jobs with far worse pay?
It's a good question. We don't have a comparison group, so we can't say that for sure. But we did find that earnings growth for apprentices was much higher, substantially higher than earnings growth for non-apprentices in the same occupation. So we can't say with certainty, but I think the evidence is highly suggestive of really strong earnings gains for apprentices, particularly in newer occupations, healthcare and in information technology. Apprentices in those occupations saw the highest earnings growth. We also observed a narrowing of the gender wage gap among apprentices. On average, men earn more than women, but after completing the apprenticeship program, earnings growth was higher for women than men. So we saw sort of a narrowing of the gender wage gap over time. So really lots of sort of positive evidence.
Do you know why that is?
Great question. We think it's largely due to the occupations in which apprentices enrolled. Women often enrolled in healthcare occupations, and those occupations were associated with higher earnings growth, more so than sort of the traditional trades and some of the advanced manufacturing, which saw earnings growth, but not quite as great.
Okay, understood. Let's bring Dr. Bryan Coyne back in, because I do want to get the perspective of what's been going on in Ireland, where I know an apprenticeship scheme was launched about a decade ago because not enough new younger employees were entering the insurance sector. Tell us how that's worked.
Absolutely. So I suppose the insurance apprenticeship is Ireland's first Level 8 NFQ. It's a Level 6 European qualification framework tier. And what it does, I suppose, is it was conceived with the idea of addressing industry needs with a lack of younger labour supply into the sector. And it's not just it's a very prominent sector in Ireland. It actually surprised me when I found this, but the insurance sector is worth 25% of the Irish financial services sector. So it is not a small sector. So the lack of talent and early career talent in that space was particularly glaring. So the apprenticeship is sort of a three-party arrangement between an industry consortium, a higher education provider, and then sort of the VET coordinator in Ireland. So this Level 8 degree was sort of formed in addition to a degree. Apprentices also get the professional qualifications which are needed to operate and perform in the sector, and they'll also get the on-the-job experience. So if you want to think about the timeline of a career, up till now, you can take a traditional pathway, which is quite sequential, where you'll do your degree, which might be a generic business degree, 3 years, 4 years. Then you go and you get signed on with a firm as a graduate. And in the first 2 years with your firm, you would do your professional qualifications. And after that point, you can then kind of get access to the full menu of roles and responsibilities and pay that would be commensurate. With the apprenticeship, that all happens simultaneously. So you get your employment, you spend 4 days a week in work, 1 day a week online in college over 3 years. You get your professional qualifications, you get a degree award, which is something that we feel or found that the students kind of cared about a little bit more than the employer particularly. But you have all that done in the space of 3 years. So it's something that's really, really taken off. We've got our highest enrollments in the past couple of years. It just goes from strength to strength. And when we did a sort of a qualitative case study looking at apprentices, graduates and employers all at the end of 2022, what we found was when we asked for the salary of the graduates, on average, they exceeded sort of similar graduates nationwide in the field of study of business, but also graduates who moved into the financial and insurance sector of employment. So we felt, and looking at the data, it was pretty evident that if you correlate the compensation that a graduate earns with sort of the caliber, that the insurance apprenticeship graduates were really coming out of their experience with a lot of skills, very high caliber, very competent, and we saw that get rewarded in the labour market at the same time.
What, if any, reaction has there been from other businesses in Ireland to this? Do other industries look over their shoulder and think, oh, look what's going on over there with the insurance sector, we should do something like that? Or are they unaware or oblivious of what's been going on?
Absolutely. That's a really interesting question. So what we have seen in my past decade in higher education, what we have noticed is there's always been a lot of pressure about pathways into higher education. And traditionally, it's always you do primary education, you do secondary education, and then you sort of get routed into college and you do your degree. And even if it doesn't work out perfectly or you don't get perfectly matched at your first employment, you'll do a postgrad and upskill later on. With this generation apprenticeship, since 2013, there's been an action plan and a focus on new apprenticeship provision. There's been a bit of a lead time in building up these apprenticeships because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of collaboration required between industry and academia, which has not always been there. And you also want to make sure that the apprenticeships you're designing are built to last, which means that there's a sufficient demand in the sector from employers, but also sufficient interest from potential employees that they can view themselves and have a career in this space. So in the time since we've had the insurance apprenticeship set up, there's been a lot more non-traditional apprenticeships set up in Ireland. Even there's now an apprenticeship starting in financial services regulation, and it's in tandem with our central bank, which is a really interesting collaboration where you start seeing that type of association. You have marketing, you have retail, you have a lot of areas where apprenticeship is coming in. And I think a lot of the motivation behind that is the idea of having targeted skills formation. So we get industry feedback on our academic provision and we make sure that it is suitably tailored to the academic level, but we also make sure that the skills that the graduates are going to have are aligned with what they'll be expected to do in the sector. So it addresses mismatch. Is it a silver bullet? I don't think so. There's still a big role. We have a lot of students who still have the more generic pathway and they find their own way. But if you know what you want to do early on, or even if you're a school leaver and you're coming back to education and you know what you want to do, an apprenticeship is really helpful. And in speaking to firms, these firms have been really vocal about the idea that this reduces their onboarding costs. This increases, it's a valuable pipeline for talent, and they might have only the resources to hire an apprentice as opposed to another employee. They'll have an apprentice, they'll upskill them, and when that apprentice graduates, they'll get another one. So it's a really valuable proposition in the market. And it also lets the industries have a say in academic curriculum development, which is not something that they would have in the traditional sector where it isn't the case.
There are lots of interesting points you just made there. And I want to bring Doug Walton back in to get the US perspective, because are there successful apprenticeship schemes in the States which have led to greater awareness and potentially other businesses taking up apprenticeship schemes as well?
There have, but not nearly to the extent as in many European countries. Apprenticeship is both smaller in the U.S. As I mentioned earlier, less than 0.5% of the workforce is involved in an apprenticeship. And it is also not as widespread within industries. It's much more employer-led. Typically, apprenticeships are developed at either the employer level among a consortium of employers, sometimes in conjunction with a union. But the apprenticeships in the U.S. tend to be more customized towards the needs of particular employers. So employers use apprenticeship as a way to train workers for their firm. So it tends to be a employer-led model rather than a sort of educational system-led model.
Do you think there's any scope for that changing in the near future or not? Or do you think it needs to change?
I think certainly expanding within industries where it's shown to be successful, I think would be a really good strategy for the future. The new administration in the U.S. has set a goal of increasing the number of apprentices to over 1 million, and I think one efforts to expand in that direction would be a good thing. One One of the challenges that some firms have reported that has sort of held them back from offering even more apprenticeship slots is the challenge with poaching. So employers make all these investments in an apprentice, and they might complete their program. These apprentices have all these skills that the employers have invested in, and then they take those skills and move to other employers. And so in that case, the employer doesn't recoup all the costs that they've invested in their apprentices. So a funding mechanism that removes some of the financial costs of apprenticeship from the employer. The U.S. Department of Labor has funded a number of grant efforts that have covered some of the costs of training for employers. I think an expansion of those could also be a solution to increasing and inducing more employers to offer apprenticeship slots.
I'm sure the issue of poaching is an issue in many countries. Professor Bryan Coyne, in Ireland, how big an issue is it, and what is done or could be done to try to prevent that from happening? Should it be prevented from happening?
So I suppose in terms of the poaching, I suppose less with the apprenticeship, but I know anecdotally that we would other countries have tried to navigate this, and not with apprenticeship, but with like funding higher education. So if we pay for your college, what does it look like? And I know in Australia that they will cover a lot of the fees of attending higher education. But if you emigrate, when you come back in, like you will have to repay some of those fees, with the idea that the public benefit or the public good spent on putting you through college should be recouped in that sense. It's kind of like a non-compete in that way. With the apprenticeship, with the employer side, you'd hear anecdotally from the odd employer here or there of going, oh, I lost the apprentice. They didn't want to stay on at the rate of pay or at what was going or things like that. Sometimes those are generally ticky-tacky issues. What we would say and we would be supportive of is the idea that this is a pathway for education and employment that would lift the tide, which would raise it for all boats. So although you might have an apprentice that moves on, you could get another apprentice if that's the tier of employee that you're happy to have. And then that graduate has better skills. They might progress within the company, in a different branch of the company, or in a different company, even in a different sector. We've had insurance students who've gone and moved into investments, pensions, things like that. Like, we've even had some that have one has gone to go and be a guard, a police officer, so that's where that student really valued the degree qualification that they got out of it, less so than the insurance side. But there's real value in that. So we would say it's a net positive for the sector as a whole, because what we really felt back from the study is that employers valued the real-time knowledge transfer. So they're not waiting forever to hear about new innovations. They're hearing it from their apprentices, and they're able to embed it in their workflow sort of very, very quickly. So they get the benefit while they're there, in addition to getting it if they stay on. But they're in the program, they have an apprentice for the benefit at that time.
Doug mentioned earlier on that in America, in particular, it's a very small, narrow number of industries which use apprenticeships. How do you go about changing mindsets so that apprenticeships aren't just associated with traditional trades like plumbing or being an electrician, whatever it is? Doug or Bryan, please come in on this.
Absolutely. In the U.S., over the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, we have seen an expansion into new occupations, healthcare, financial services, information technology. Some of the strategies that have worked well for that expansion has been additional funding, so grant funding from the U.S. Department of Labor. Grantees who have received grant funding have really focused on recruiting employers through marketing campaigns, just to sort of spread the word that apprenticeship isn't just for the old, building trades, that it can be used for modern, new occupations. Funding to cover the costs of technical instruction have encouraged employer adoption of apprenticeship, and making sure that the apprenticeship standards meet the requirements of industry. In IT, for example, the technology is rapidly changing, so apprenticeship programs have to be agile and teach the skills that are in demand now, not the skills that were in demand 10 years ago.
Okay, Bryan, what do you think? How do you get people to change their mindsets and businesses for that matter as well.
I don't want this conversation to distract or diminish the idea that the craft apprenticeships are really valuable still. You know, we're here in Ireland, we have an acute shortage of all those craft skills. We have a very significant and substantial housing crisis and a lot of infrastructural deficits which speak to the need for craft apprenticeship. But in the non-traditional sectors, or how do we promote it? I suppose regulatory stability is something not to be overlooked. And it's kind of one of those, it's kind of like the secret sauce in the whole puzzle. When you're thinking about how does something get a reputation? And part of that is that it is around for a while. So you, as an employer, know if I go with this process, it'll still be there in 3 years' time when my apprentice is done. I'm not going to have the plates move under my feet or have the rug pulled so that I'm left with a very junior employee that's not qualified. So having that in place is really important. And I suppose that's something that we felt on the insurance apprenticeship. We're about to welcome our 10th cohort coming in September. And part of that security and stability is really valuable. Other things that might be beneficial, I suppose, to promote it. We at open days, you'd often get in a lot of school kids who'd be coming into college. They wouldn't necessarily be looking quite as heavily at the apprenticeships, especially for the non-craft sector. You know, oftentimes we'll hear from a student, oh, I didn't know you do an apprenticeship in marketing or an apprenticeship in insurance. You know, it's not something they necessarily considered. Whereas because of the long legacy of craft apprenticeships, kids know from 15, 16 that if you want to be an electrician, you go to your electrician's apprenticeship. You know, they know that that's their pathway, that's on their journey. So part of it is just setting it up properly in a market where there's a clear demand, where employers will support it, because it kind of withers on the vine without the employers there to back it and to keep it going. And having it there in place long enough. Part of that's a public funding thing as well, as Doug mentioned, subsidies, grant supports, helping to bridge that gap. If we feel that apprenticeship has such an important public good aspect, then there is a case to be made that public funding could maybe help be the glue that keeps it all together.
Are there good reasons why some industries don't usually use apprenticeships?
Yeah, I suppose I'm speaking as someone who I came through the traditional university sector. I did my undergrad in finance and accounting. I did my master's. I did my PhD, that kind of academic track. But if I wanted to go be an economist, that would probably be the track. You know, that's my space. So there's plenty of room for all of that. And especially if you don't want to be cornered into one profession or one sector, you know, that's why we find with our insurance apprenticeship, the degree award is really important for the students, because when they graduate, even if they want to move sector completely, oftentimes the honours degree is a minimum requirement for a lot of jobs, particularly in the public sector. So if you want to go and work in a different field, that's fine, but at least the degree will help them show and demonstrate, I have a set level of proficiency, I've made it through a degree, I'm a bit more battle tested, and I sort of stand out relative to my peers. So there's absolutely, I think there's absolutely still a role for for the traditional track, but apprenticeship is a valuable pathway.
But isn't that saying very clearly why there is such a barrier to expanding apprenticeships a lot of the time? Because it's just accepted by many businesses and people that they need to have a degree if they want to pursue a great many different types of careers.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a lot of instances where we have a tight labour market in Ireland where there's not that many available jobs and there's a lot of people available and skilled to do it. Now, we have one of the highest rates of qualified or people qualified at third level higher education. So there's kind of an inflation effect in that space where if most of the people have some sort of higher education, what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to people that are overskilled for a lot of the jobs that they might do. And you do hear stories, and the big takeaway is that you want to try and minimize mismatch. And ultimately, what does the degree do in a labour market? It acts as a signal to employers that this employee is saying, although it's a piece of paper, it speaks a lot more as to the skills and things that they're able to do, like from their program, how they've gotten on with it. And I think it's just a helpful quality assurance seal for an employer if you're going to take someone. But there are absolutely employers, particularly maybe more so the bigger employers, that would be happier to take on employees saying you don't need a degree. It's not a minimum requirement, but come in, interview, and let's see how it goes.
In the U.S., many states have recently passed legislation that have removed degree requirements from a number of state jobs. So more of a focus on sort of skills first hiring rather than degree first hiring. And I believe a number of companies have sort of followed suit. So I think that is a trend going forward, more of an emphasis on skills versus education.
Yeah, if I was to put myself in the shoes of someone working in resourcing and talent management for a firm, it's probably an easier thing to fall back on to say, oh, well, I'll just use a degree requirement to get someone that's suitably qualified, rather than maybe if they're not familiar with the skills-based approach, as Doug mentioned, they might have to do a little bit more interrogation of, well, what exactly do we want this person to do and what do we want them to be able to do and all those things. So it's good that it's there, but it's also good that it's not being the deciding factor, I suppose, in a lot of cases, which is great to hear from across the ocean.
Yeah, Doug, what would you say to a business which had a requirement of a degree, and if you were putting forward that they should switch to a skills-first approach, what arguments would you make?
I'd make a number of arguments. I think the first is it broadens your pool of candidates. In many industries, many occupations in the U.S., there are more job openings than there are available workers. So I think one key factor there is that it broadens your pool of candidates. It helps you bring in more sort of non-traditional candidates, those who might not have had the educational opportunities that others have had. Sort of increases your pool of candidates, gives you a better chance of finding talent to sort of fill those roles.
I would imagine it might also help minimize churn a little bit. You know, if you have someone with a degree and there's a high level of mismatch between the role that they've secured, you know, there's a lot of reasons why they might take a job that's not necessarily at their level of education. Those people might be looking at the next opportunity right away, which they might not stay in their current role, which just sort of might mean that you have a bit more turnover than you'd expect in a firm. Whereas if you are able to liberalize that a little bit and open it up, you might get people that are happier in the role that is carved out for them.
If you were advising a policymaker on how to expand apprenticeships into new fields and for higher levels of education, what would you suggest should be done?
I suppose the first big thing that I would think is that it's all market driven, you know? So it really has to come from the employers that say we have a screaming need for skilled talent in this sector. And it could be that people don't usually go into the sector, or that there's some barriers to entry that are maybe a bit non-traditional or atypical. But you would want there to know that there's a need and that it's not just a once-off thing. Because if you want the apprenticeship in place, you want it there long term. You don't want to just sort of start one up and then shut it down the moment you've addressed your temporary need. So it would want to be something that is a persistent need in the industry. And then you could talk apprenticeship. Whereas otherwise, you might do a smaller, less intensive kind of intervention if you're trying to just get a quick, short shock of employees into a space.
Are there industries in the US, Doug, where you think apprenticeships are hugely needed and they're not being used?
I think apprenticeships in healthcare is a really promising avenue. I think they're not very commonly used, but there are many sort of healthcare pathways where workers can sort of move up the career ladder within healthcare. In the U.S., the occupational ladder typically starts with a nursing assistant, then something called a patient care technician, which typically takes one year of training, all the way up through registered nurse, which often requires a degree. Integrating apprenticeship into that nursing career ladder, I think, would help bring new candidates into that field and help alleviate the sort of nursing shortage in the U.S.
Are efforts happening right now to try to achieve that?
There are. A number of the DOL grantees have been organizations that have sought to increase apprenticeship in healthcare. So that's definitely something happening now, and I think is a great avenue for moving forward. Something else interesting that I don't think we've talked about yet about apprenticeship in the U.S. is that many apprentices, and I'm curious how this contrasts with Ireland, many apprentices in the U.S. are sort of older workers. I think the average apprentice is 30, early 30s. So it's less directly connected to the educational system and much more aligned with the workforce system. I think integrating apprenticeship earlier in the educational system would also be a mechanism to increase the number of apprentices by making it more of a core in the U.S., more of a core component of the educational system. I'm curious how that contrasts with the Ireland experience.
Yeah, so what we have for the data we've collected for the insurance apprenticeship for the year that we looked at it, the average age of the apprentice is 26. Now, to contrast that with the typical school leaver, which would be entering college at age 18, 19 and leaving college age 21, 22, it is clearly something that is appealing to people returning to education, or perhaps people who never had that opportunity at the first instance. So we would also agree with the idea that apprenticeship would help with widening access to higher education. Not just in terms of age, but also in terms of gender. We find that our insurance apprenticeship has a really, really nice gender balance and representation, particularly when you compare it with the traditional craft apprenticeships. But sure, we'd expect correlation on that basis anyways. But it is something that's really useful. And I suppose I want to mention, because we're talking about the expansion into healthcare, I remember we were all together at the OECD symposium on new skills and new fields for apprenticeship. We had colleagues from Washington State talking about apprenticeships for educational providers and teachers and things like that. And we also had colleagues from Germany talking about apprenticeship being rolled out in healthcare settings for nursing as well. So anywhere where there's a clear and persistent need for talent, I think is a candidate for consideration for an apprenticeship. Absolutely, particularly in those lines of work where there's a significant public good to be had from having that talent in place.
I want to talk about perceptions briefly, because it is an issue. How do you tackle the reputational challenges which are sometimes associated with apprenticeships, where they are sometimes associated with specific trades or potentially looked down upon and seen as a fallback option to people in education?
If I were trying to recruit new apprentices, I would show them some of the evidence around earnings growth for apprentices in a variety of occupations. Our study at the American Apprenticeship Initiative found that the average apprentice, after completing their program, earned about $53,000 per year. This was a 50% increase from their pre-program earnings. Earnings were highest for those in information technology occupations. Those apprentices earned about $62,000 after completing their program. So to me, that's sort of hard evidence about what the outcomes really are for potential candidates is really compelling.
What about the arguments for businesses? Businesses who have never shown an interest in apprenticeships before. How do you change their perceptions towards apprenticeships?
We have evidence there too on the return on investments for employers. A typical employer experienced a return on investment of about 44% for every dollar invested in an apprenticeship. So I think showing employers that other firms in their space are doing the same thing and really benefiting from apprenticeship is, I think, a really compelling argument.
As a quantitative researcher, I'm very envious of the research Doug has done in the US setting. I would absolutely be of the mindset that if you show objective facts, that this is something that should be able to change hearts and minds. But unfortunately, the way hearts and minds work is that they are often motivated by qualitative evidence, which is something that I've come to learn over this journey with this apprenticeship in particular. So a lot of this work is about showcasing the talent they get, hearing from employers, publishing the stories. And that's not just true at a apprenticeship level, it's also true at a national level. We have an apprenticeship website for Ireland, which is it's called Generation Apprenticeship, and it has a load of case studies and testimonials and things like that, not just from the apprentices, but also from the employers, because I think it's something that might appear, if I'm an employer and I'm joining an apprenticeship, is it quite an onerous commitment? Do I have to run the whole thing? What's the commitment? And I think having a bit of clarity and hearing from peers in that sense is really, really valuable. I'm speaking as someone in Ireland, and I suppose compared to the US, we're a much, much smaller country. So we have the luxury of being a little bit smaller, but the concept, the idea still stands that sometimes the qualitative case study evidence is really beneficial to change and influence perceptions.
So by the sound of what you're saying, how much of this is a PR issue where if apprenticeships are having such a positive impact on businesses and people, why aren't more people shouting about it, and why isn't more being done to expand them?
Just classifying it as a PR issue is correct, but it's also maybe missing the mark, because it's a PR issue on multiple fronts. There's a job to do to convince policymakers that this is vital and this is valuable and this is worth backing. There's a job to convince employers that this is valuable and it's vital and it's worth doing. And then there's a job to convince education providers of the same, and also students. The deal doesn't work without all parties at the table. And we can put in all the resources to make an apprenticeship that's perfectly calibrated, well geared, good industry. But if we're not reaching the ears of the people who are coming onto the course and moving through it, that's a problem. So we see in Ireland the generation apprenticeship, the earn and learn. There's a lot of resources put behind advertising and marketing it now that we know what we have. It's a really valuable pathway. I suppose in the insurance apprenticeship, we're really lucky in the sense that it's not just one or two employers that come in on an ad hoc basis. We have an industry consortium comprised of the Insurance Institute of Ireland, the LIA, and they both help to promote the course. So when you're getting that kind of vocal enthusiasm from the top levels of industry, it makes our job a little bit easier. But again, the temporal aspect is something to consider. It can't just be a one-shot game where you think of it for 1 year and that's it and it's gone like that. It has to be something that's there persistently for potential students to even consider it as a viable pathway, because what they want at the end of the day is they want certainty that if I make it through this successfully, what's waiting for me at the other side.
Okay. I want to quickly talk about the changing jobs market and the jobs market of the future, because obviously there's huge technological changes, predictions of millions of jobs disappearing and millions of new jobs being created. We know that AI, the push towards net zero, is a big part of this, and it's creating a huge demand for skilled workers, and that these big gaps are going to need to be filled. So how big a role can apprenticeships play to fill those gaps?
I think apprenticeship can play a large role, particularly because employers have a say in what skills are taught during the program. Because the apprenticeships are often employer led, the training can be customized to meet the demands of today, the requirements that employers have today. In the U.S., there's bipartisan support around expanding apprenticeship, particularly in the information technology occupations, even around things like AI. So I do think there's a hopeful time that apprenticeship can be a tool for the new occupations.
What about in Ireland? What needs to happen to get those kinds of apprenticeships off the ground, if indeed there are any moves to do so?
The digital transformation and the digital sort of experience we're doing, and the climate transition, the journey towards net zero, those are the challenges of probably not just our lifetime, but also probably the next generations. And it's really something that it's not probably just enough to have a course designed to tackle that. These are prevailing ideas. The digital transformation, it's embedded across every sector, nearly every sector. The climate transition, it's across nearly every sector. So if I head down the corridor and I speak to my colleagues who work in lecturing the construction apprenticeship, or they are dealing with passive house style. They're dealing with the need for net zero buildings. If I go and talk to my colleagues who are working in insurance, they're talking about, we have a certificate in climate risk, which has been set up by the Insurance Institute. That's been running for the last couple of years. It's been incredibly popular because it's been a means of upskilling and reskilling for existing working professionals. So I wouldn't just say it's strictly the role of apprenticeship to address those targets. I would say, as an educator, as an academic working in higher education, both apprenticeship and traditional education, we deal with those things at the same time, because we are always trying to make sure that our courses and what we're teaching students is correct, it's up to date, and it's future-proofing them for the world that they're about to head out into. So these things are persistent. They have sort of roots in every aspect of every firm. We do a bit of research looking at digital transformation and sustainability orientation for manufacturing firms or SMEs. Apprenticeship isn't just for that, but it can be for that, in addition to all the other pathways for education that we have.
Okay, thank you so much. We are running low in time, so thank you to you both. I think we've mentioned that job markets are changing, education systems need to adapt to prepare young people for the changes. And I think from what you've both been saying there, it's pretty clear that apprenticeships do offer a part of a solution to that issue. To those listening, do you agree? Are apprenticeships a key part to solving the job skills crisis? Please write in your comments on whatever platform you use to get your podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again to Doug Walton from Abt Global in the US and Dr. Bryan Coyne from the Atlantic Technological University in Sligo, Ireland. That's it for now. Please subscribe or follow the Top Class podcast wherever you do get your podcasts, and we'll be back with another episode of Top Class soon. All the best.